I'm Devin Stahl. I'm 5'9", long brown hair. I have a red lip today because it felt like an important day to introduce our emerging scholar. I have a blue and white polka dot dress on. I had one more announcement. Some of us will be going over to the library at lunchtime to view the St. John's Bible. They're putting it out special just for us. If you haven't heard of it, the St. John's Bible was commissioned by St. John's Abbey as a handwritten calligraphy Bible. It has incredible imagery in it. They will put it out and allow us to browse through it. So if that is something that you're interested in, Rosemary Garland Thompson and I will be heading over there, and then we'll go to lunch right after that. The library's not too far from here, and I'm happy to guide us all over there for those who are interested. Right. So in 2016, the Institute for Theology and Disability inaugurated an annual lecture series to feature and celebrate the work of emerging scholars in the field of theology and disability. Since the Institute began in 2010, we've seen the emergence of new scholars entering the field with their PhD thesis or other publications. By establishing this annual plenary lecture, the Institute seeks to honor this development by providing an opportunity for one of these emerging scholars each year to present themselves to the wider audience. And this year, we received an unprecedented number of outstanding nominations. So many, in fact, that I had to recruit several outside readers in the field, in addition to several members of our ITD faculty to read these dissertations. So first of all, thank you to all of those readers who spent many, many hours carefully reading dissertations and writing detailed reports about their qualities. And thanks to those of you who nominated yourselves and your recommenders. I hope that we see all of your dissertations published. So our winner this year is Dr. Jaime Konerman-Sease. Dr. Konerman-Sease is a clinical ethics assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Center for Bioethics. She provides clinical ethics services for 9 hospitals in the M Health Fairview system, serves as a member of the ethics committee, and leads the popular virtual lecture series Unpacking Bedside Bioethics. Dr. Konerman-Sease completed her PhD in healthcare ethics and theology at Saint Louise University. Her research focuses on the intersection of disability, medicine, literature, and theology. By drawing from historical sources, she highlights novel solutions to modern-day healthcare problems. Her current project draws on the novels of Jane Austen to provide solutions to the marginalization of patients with chronic and incurable illness in medicine. Building on her own experience living with chronic fatigue, she reimagines how to resist cure obsession and embrace the possibility that fatigued bodies can flourish without cure. So join me in welcoming Dr. Konerman-Sease.
Thank you all so much. Jaime Konerman-Sease. I am a short white woman with long brown hair, wearing a gray top and blue pants, both of which I made myself. My lecture today, I'm also in my 30s. I am actually exactly 30. So my lecture today is called Virtue for Tired Bodies. I want to explore the broad question of what it means to be a good person with fatigue. Like many Christians, I inherited an understanding of good person that is defined by doing things, mostly through helping others, but also with a strong dose of idle hands are the devil's workshop, which fused productivity with virtue. And during my first experience with fatigue and being bedbound for 4 months, I experienced deep distress at my idleness. Every sense of my understanding of virtue was called into question. But also questions about my survival. How can I live if I can't work? How can I maintain friendships if I can't go out and do things? How will my marriage survive if I can't bring anything to the relationship? Who am I if I can't do anything? I was stripped of all markers of my identity. The Protestant ethic I inherited failed to support or guide me during my illness. Instead, I felt damned and alone. So the main question that I want to take up in this lecture is, how should we frame morality in the context of chronic fatigue? To answer this question, I'm drawing on the past to inform the present. This can be challenging. We are all aware of the ethical failures of our ancestors. However, I think that we have progressed, or to think that we have progressed beyond having cultural or social failures, or that in the present we're somehow unilaterally more ethical than the past, I think that's a mistake. I claim that historical understandings of health, wellness, and community are essential to addressing the cure-obsessed, productivity-driven culture and medical culture that we have around us today. I'm relying on the virtue ethics of Jane Austen because her novels are both captivating stories and complex cultural critiques. Each story constructs ideas of virtue within the limitations of her particular place and time, and she has quite a lot to say about health and community. So, to be frank, fatigue is a problem in American culture. It's not just a problem of the body, it's social and relational. It's a problem bound up in morality. In a capitalist economic system which ties inherent worth to productivity, the inability to do things is problematic. Fatigue is also a problem for the Protestant work ethic, which ties being a good person to helping others through actions. Within these framings, fatigue is a problem to be solved. It's a devastating condition which isolates people from their working communities. Instead of thinking of fatigue as a problem we must solve, I want to reframe the problem of fatigue from a relational perspective. I want to think about what it means to live the good life as a person with fatigue, to be a good person with fatigue. Specifically, what does it mean to love your neighbor when we have fatigue? I want to use the pronoun we very broadly here. It applies to those of us with chronic fatigue, chronic illnesses, but also to every person who will inevitably get sick, who will get the flu or COVID and experience fatigue. In a world framed by capitalism, we will all experience fatigue, burnout, and exhaustion. So we need to integrate fatigue into our expectations of daily life and anticipate its presence. Fatigue significantly impacts relationships. Jennifer Brea's 2017 documentary Unrest highlights the relational questions of fatigue. The documentary centers her growing questions about maintaining or starting new relationships when she lives with chronic fatigue. The centrality of relationships is highlighted on the documentary promotional pictures, which I've included on this slide, and shows Brea in her bed surrounded by boxes of vitamins and pills, with her husband lying next to her with his arms around her shoulder. At one point in the movie, she claims, "I can't be someone's mom like this," which later evolves into, "I can't be someone's wife like this." And later she turns to her husband and tells him, "I am nothing. I can't give you anything." Brea's questions reveal the deeply relational questions that fatigue brings forth. How can we be in relationship if we cannot give anything? They also highlight this deeply cultural expectation that we must be physically well to have good relationships. Brea shares these concerns with Casey Jackson, a woman who developed fatigue after having 2 children, who shares that her husband left her because Jackson doctors said her fatigue was, quote, all in her head, unquote, and he thought she was faking it for attention. That my worst fear actually happened to Jackson is terrifying. I can relate to the questions and fears about maintaining and meeting expectations in relationships that are shared in Unrest. I too felt that my fatigue prevented me from being the kind of person I wanted to be in my relationships. So I think this question about morality for fatigued bodies has 2 components. First, what role does cure play in living well with fatigue? And second, how can we build virtue when we're chronically exhausted? The topic of cures is essential when we explore the moral aspects of fatigue. Americans are obsessed with cures. Brea's documentary spends a good deal of time bemoaning the lack of funding to find a cure for chronic fatigue. The idea of cure is powerful, it's intoxicating, it draws us in. With the promise of being free from suffering. We believe in the all-powerful medical institution to solve any bodily problems, and we praise narratives of those who fight through illness to find a cure. Our battle approach towards illness drives us to do everything, to ward off death itself. In fact, doing everything is a kind of moral imperative for our bodies. If we don't do everything, we get a sense that we have morally failed, both ourselves and our communities and our families. But for fatigued bodies who never get a formal diagnosis and who've no treatment options, a question remains. When should we stop seeking a cure? And at what point is it okay to live with fatigue? Our cure obsession, our obsession with cures, comes from a particular place and time in history. For most of human history, the idea of bodily cures was in the realm of the miraculous. It was not something achievable solely by human hands. In the Hippocratic tradition, which we can call the traditional Western medicine, most of medical treatment focused on restoring balance through lifestyle practices and herbs. In fact, the meaning of the word cure in the medieval period actually connotated this idea of treatment or intervention, providing something to address something. It comes from the Latin verb cura, which means to care. During the shift from Hippocratic medicine to scientific medicine, cure transitioned from a verb to a noun. A cure could be obtained to solve the problem of disease. Starting in the 16th century, philosophers and physicians began to talk of a cure as they imagined the ability for science to radically transform the body. We can see this infatuation with the idea of cure in the writings of the Marquis de Condorcet, a French philosopher writing in 1793, and the words will be on the screen. The improvement of medical practice, he writes, which will become more efficacious with the progress of reason and of the social order, will mean the end of infectious and hereditary diseases and illnesses brought on by climate or food or working conditions. It is reasonable to hope that all other diseases may likewise disappear as their distant causes are discovered. This was in 1793. The story of exactly how the West became obsessed with cures is complex, fascinating, an entire chapter of my dissertation, and I wish I could spend more time discussing with you today. The most important thing to know are that the rise of consumerism in the 17th and 18th century played a significant role in advancing scientific medicine as the dominant model of medical care. Not because scientific medicine was more efficacious, but because its products, the products of scientific medicine, could be packaged and sold. They were tied to the idea of luxury and identity for a consuming shopping public. This combined with skyrocketing rates of literacy and the proliferation of medical advertisements in print, typically from quack physicians who employed cure language to make sales, created a public in Britain who became deeply infatuated with the idea of a cure. And establishment physicians adopted that same cure language to compete. It seemed like everyone wanted a cure, and so that's what doctors set out to do. Though not everyone wanted a cure. Since the beginning of the explosion of commercialized medicine, there has always been a resistance. Physicians, herbalists, midwives, or potential consumers who consciously and deliberately did not partake in cure culture. Jane Austen was one of these detractors, and her suspicion of cure culture shows up in her novels. Austen believed that cure-seeking was a misplaced understanding of health. She agreed with the Hippocratic understanding of illness, that disease or dis-ease was due to imbalance in the body and life. Lifestyle imbalances like overindulging in rich foods or working too hard without rest led to sickness. The best way to prevent and treat illness was to approach life moderately and to ward off illness from occurring in the first place, specifically to have good habits of health in the 6 non-natural states, which are also on the screen, which are food, drink, exercise, waste evacuation, sleep, and environment or mindset. Moderation is key to this understanding of health, and Austen wrote the importance of moderation into her novels. Characters who overindulge or are overly restrictive in any of these areas experience bodily consequences which have relational implications. Seeking cures instead of working towards moderating your lifestyle was a wrong way to think about health. Cure-seeking was a way of ignoring the true causes of your bodily ailments, which are bad habits, and throwing money around to fix it in a way that ultimately serves the desire to consume, rather than address their conditions at the root. Austen's disdain for cure culture is deeply tied to her Anglican theology, most specifically her emphasis on neighbor love. Each of Austen's novels is a case study in how to exercise neighbor love. Each heroine has different traits, different family drama, different financial means, and each novel presents a story of a heroine learning what it means to love others and love herself, echoing the great commandment of Matthew 22, which says, and this is on the slide, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And teacher, Jesus, he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." For Anglicans in the 18th century, interpreting this verse with the principle of moderation was the most important thing. It was the most important theological concept. Its importance of moderation represents that pendulum swing back towards the middle after the extremism, the religious extremism of the political or the Puritan movement, both politically and theologically. Austen's understanding of neighbor love was deeply tied to this concept of moderation. Neighbor love was about balancing the desires of your own heart with the duty to love your neighbor. It meant that we should consider our own happiness and the happiness of those who we are in relationship with and seek to balance the needs of the two. The goal of neighbor love was to be in right relationship with others, and I put right relationship in quotations here. Prioritizing our own happiness above others is misplaced, but also prioritizing the happiness of others at the expense of ourselves is equally misplaced. While the goal of working towards right relationships extends across place and time, how we are in right relationship is bound by our particulars. Being in right relationship was certainly different in Austen's time than our own. Her community was committed to ideas like the great chain of being that most of us no longer share today. Nor did her community have the kind of death-defying medical technology that Americans take for granted. We shouldn't seek to replicate the choices that Austen's heroines make, but we can adopt the model and the method, the goal and the method. Austen's emphasis on right relationships and exploring how to work that out within the limitations of culture can be incredibly helpful for us today. For Austen, health was wrapped up in the concept of neighbor love. Health is more than the integrated functioning of the mechanistic body. Health is equilibrium. Health is balance in human life. It encompasses physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual. This means that one can have a well and functioning body, but still lack this all-encompassing idea of health. Similarly, one could lack bodily health, but still be healthy, or at least work towards the other areas of health in life. Health itself is not the goal of living a good life. Health is a means to the end. Having a healthy body, you can still live a morally corrupt life. Health is only a good worth pursuing if it can assist in God's call for us on earth, which is to love one's neighbor. To be sure, bodily health is valuable, and it should be pursued, but only if it enables one to participate in relationships. Cure obsession is the imbalanced pursuit of health, at the expense of the self and others. Cure seeking, as it manifested in upper and middle and upper class life in England, was more about showing one's wealth and status and not about addressing the true causes of disease. At the same time, it placed a great burden on the lower classes and the land. Cure obsession was a mark of being in wrong relationships with others and prioritizing the self too highly over the community. So at this point, I'd like to return to the questions that I asked before. Oop, not yet. As far as the main question, how should we frame morality in the context of chronic fatigue? The answer to this in the Christian tradition is grounded in the great commandment, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. It's the same as it would be for everyone else. We should draw on Austen here, though, and orient our love of neighbor towards this idea of pursuing right relationship. The call to work towards right relationship, it's the same for everyone, including those with chronic fatigue. But how we work that out, how we perform, how we actionize that call, does change with the presence of fatigue. That's why these two sub-questions that I asked earlier are so important. And I'm going to dive into Austen's novels to explore the answer to the questions of cure and how to build morality and virtue when we have fatigue. So first, how long should we pursue a cure? If bodily health is prioritized above everything, our pursuit of a cure would be never-ending. And it could include the dissolution of important caring relationships. But if we learn from Austen's understanding of virtue, cure should never be prioritized over the development and maintenance of a right relationship. Our goal should not be to find a cure. Our goal should be to learn from medicine and wellness techniques to support us in participating in our relationships. If a cure is available, sure, it can help us and build strong and loving relationships. By all means, go for it, do it. But if the pursuit of cures becomes an obsession and it alienates us from our communities of care, or it becomes a burden on the land or others, it's not worth taking up. Instead, we need to refocus on balance, building bodily health so we can participate in relationships. One of my favorite passages from Austen's Emma highlights the importance of prioritizing maintenance of relationship over the pursuit of cure. In this scene, Emma and her elderly father, Mr. Woodhouse, are visited by Emma's sister Isabella. Isabella recounts her travels to Southend for sea air and bathing, a trip she took to solve, quote, the weakness in little Bella's throat, end quote, at the recommendation of her apothecary, Mr. Wingfield. What follows is a genteel argument between father and daughter over which apothecary is better, Isabella's Mr. Wingfield or Mr. Woodhouse's Mr. Perry. And there's an illustration of Mr. Woodhouse and Mr. Perry on the screen from the 1893 version of the novel. The key to this argument is Emma's repeated interjections, trying to steer her family away from arguing about the most immovable topic, for both are wholly dedicated to their own apothecaries, onto what they ought to discuss, the people from Isabella's childhood who are invested in her well-being, the relationships. This is what Emma says. Come, come, cried Emma, feeling this to be an unsafe subject. I must beg you to not talk of the sea. It makes me envious and miserable, I who've never seen it. I've not heard you make one inquiry after Mr. Perry yet, and he never forgets you. Though we soon learn that bringing up Mr. Perry was certainly the wrong move on Emma's part, for it spurs on Mr. Woodhouse's defense of Mr. Perry's methods while scorning those of Mr. Wingfield. Emma continues to interject in the conversation over the next 5 pages. 5 pages, trying her best to steer her sister and father away from arguing about health towards what really ought to matter, or at least what propriety at the time said should be discussed, which is relationships. However, Emma's battle is a losing one, as no matter who she brings up, their health is always mentioned, discussed, and argued over by her 2 health-obsessed family members. While concerns about health usually designate feelings of care between 2 people, the way Isabella interacts with health is excessive to the point of causing harm. Her health obsession leads her to a kind of pampering that only women with a certain kind of money can do. In the case of Isabella, health obsession is a vehicle for displays of wealth, while also causing ill effects as her children have only been taught how to seek cures and preventive care of the body has been lost to them. Isabella lacks balance in her approach to the body. She believes a small tickle in a child's throat warrants an expensive cross-country trek to the curative sea air. This imbalance negatively impacts her relationship with her sister and father, as their holiday gatherings are spent arguing and asserting their own health over maintaining genuine, loving relationships. Wow, I can really relate to that holiday experience. The emphasis on balance in Austen is familiar to the reader with chronic fatigue. Embedded in Austen's novels is a culture that wrestles with finding balance between strictly managing the body for optimum health in a world where cures aren't available, and living in community and relationship. Living with chronic fatigue in the 21st century is characterized by balancing the desire to participate in a fast-paced life with the need to rest. Living with chronic fatigue means always being pulled between exhausting participation and quiet isolation. We need rest, but we also need to be in community. Chronic fatigue and other management conditions require that the sick person focus on finding balance through acquiring habits and self-discipline. The 6 areas of bodily management emphasized by the Hippocratic tradition are the same that are focused on today, though practitioners might not recognize that when they recommend management techniques like sleep hygiene, they're drawing on a centuries-old tradition. Because the Hippocratic tradition and practices were still within the zeitgeist of Austen's time, we can find a nuanced approach to balancing the pursuit of cure with the practices of management. A nuance that's become harder to find as cure culture has become the dominant paradigm for us in the West. Now I want to explore the second question. How do we build virtue if we're chronically exhausted? I'm going to dive into the text to further explore this in Austen's Mansfield Park. In Mansfield Park, Austen articulates a path towards virtue for bodies who are disabled, ill, or who have never had good bodily health. The heroine, Fanny Price, is described as weak, delicate, and puny, and has all the traits which readers in Regency England would associate with a particular kind of sick person, an invalid. Austen is not entirely positive about the role sickness or illness play in everyday life. Her characters with illnesses are often used as comedic side roles, though Austen never outright identifies characters with specific illnesses. Fanny's aunt and adoptive mother, Lady Bertram, is especially tricky when reading Mansfield Park through the lens of disability. While it's mentioned that Lady Bertram has health concerns, we learn in the beginning of the novel that she gives up the London townhouse, quote, in consequence of a little ill health and a great deal of indolence, end quote. The actual status of her health is rarely addressed. Austen leads the reader to see Lady Bertram primarily as a lazy character, whose sickness, if it exists, is secondary. Austen's treatment of Lady Bertram as lazy first and ill second is incredibly suspicious from a modern-day disability perspective. The connection between disability, illness, and laziness has plagued the disability rights community in many efforts to gain greater access to social life and medical care. Therefore, we must question if Austen uses sick characters solely as a tool to demonstrate bad character. By reading Austen's novels through the lens of illness, we can see that Austen does not suspect sick people of deception. Rather, she critiques the sick role, the role of the invalid that dominates her particular place, time, and social circle. Invalidism was a unique cultural phenomenon that began in the late 18th century and reached peak cultural prevalence in the middle and late 19th century in Western European and English-speaking cultures. Representations of the sick role underwent a major transition from the era of Georgian satire to Victorian moralizing novels. And I've put two images here on the screen. On the one side is the Georgian depiction, and the other is the Victorian. In general, Georgian novels use caricatures of illness to critique the bad habits of the wealthy and greedy practices of physicians and apothecaries. However, the Victorians saw the invalid as the moral center of culture and predominantly held a sentimental and inspirational, rather than suspicious view of illness and the suffering it caused. Austen inherited the Georgian use of illness as a tool for satire, but she was fully aware of her culture's turn toward placing wealthy women in the role of the invalid out of sentimentality and emotion. In this sense, invalidism and the sick role in Austen's novels represent the transitional time in which she lived and encompass both Georgian and Victorian sensibilities. Austen is both suspicious of the cultural role of invalidism while sensitive to the real suffering that illness can cause for individuals and communities. And the images on the screen, the Georgian one depicts ill people, one who probably has gout, overindulging and looking rather comical. We're supposed to make fun of them. And the Victorian image is a family surrounding an ill child who is highlighted in the center, who is supposed to be our kind of inspiration for becoming better people, because this poor child is suffering, and she is our moral guiding light. In general, invalidism was a trope that applied mainly to women, which determined that feeble bodies reflected feeble minds, and an enforced exclusion from rational participation in social life. When someone became ill, she was pressured to recede from rational participation in her community. She became a child woman who was eternally infantilized. Austen believed the fragility described by the medical establishment at that time was rooted in social expectations of femininity rather than fact. Austen saw invalidism as a trope, a sad category that swallowed up women and the elderly and isolated them from their communities. Her critique of invalidism does not constitute any comment on the actual experience of illness, but rather how illness is performed in communities that depend on one another. It was much more about navigating gender and class power dynamics in order to gain social leverage. We can see the trap of the invalid in Mansfield Park by attending to this character of Lady Bertram. Lady Bertram is Fanny's aunt. She's the woman who's supposed to be in charge of Mansfield Park, but rather than engaging in her family and community, Lady Bertram spends most of her time lounging on the couch with her beloved pug. When her husband Sir Thomas must leave to tend to business in Antigua, Lady Bertram is not terribly concerned about her husband making a global journey by ship in the 1800s because she is, quote, one of those persons who think nothing can be difficult or dangerous or fatiguing to anybody but themselves, end quote. By focusing on her own fatigue, Lady Bertram has fully accepted this perception that women, especially genteel women who Lady Bertram desperately wants to be, are weak and fragile, fatigue being a sign of weak health and sensitivity. However, Austen as narrator moves the reader to question if Lady Bertram is actually unwell or performs the sick role in order to disengage from public and family life and gain social leverage. Lady Bertram's general self-obsession rather than authentic illness is demonstrated throughout the novel. We learn that Lady Bertram would rather sacrifice the actual health of those around her than give up her perceived health risks, and the unfortunate effects of Lady Bertram's actions impact Fanny the most. During a particularly dramatic moment in Mansfield Park, Fanny develops a headache after spending far too much time obeying the requests of her aunts. In particular, Lady Bertram is completely inconsiderate of Fanny's ability and only thinks of herself. She writes this, or she says this in conversation, I'm very much afraid she caught the headache cutting roses in the garden, for the heat was enough to kill anybody. It was as much as I could bear myself, sitting and calling to Pug, trying to keep him from the flower beds. It was almost too much for me. While Lady Bertram and Fanny are in the garden, exposed to the hot English sun, Lady Bertram notices the heat, and she is deeply concerned, but her concern is not for Fanny engaging in pointless physical labor, but it's about her dog, presumably getting dirty or disturbing the garden. Clearly, Lady Bertram's priorities are askew. She embodies the childlike woman who has few concerns for others and is mostly concerned with herself. The largest trap of invalidism is that it encourages women to disengage from rational life and removes them from shaping the morals of those around them. Lady Bertram exemplifies the disengaged wealthy woman. Her family's lack of morals demonstrate the consequence of such disengagement. Her oldest son, Tom, is careless and extravagant and ends up causing a great deal of grievance for his family throughout the novel. To the education of her daughters, Maria and Julia, Lady Bertram, quote, paid not the smallest attention, end quote, and regardless of the best governess and the affection of their aunt, the daughters failed to gain the, again, quote from the text, less common acquirements of self-knowledge, generosity, and humility, end quote. We learn that Lady Bertram even skips her daughter's debut to remain at home, and while no reason is given for missing the perhaps most important day of her daughter's young lives, it's inferred that she simply could not be bothered. She's disengaged from her community, absent in raising her children, who ultimately suffer because of her lack of guidance. Lady Bertram, like many of Austen's parental characters, has got it all backwards. She believes that her ill health gives her license to remove herself from the moral life of her community. She believes that all she must do is keep up with the fashions and employ others to do her work. Her concern with her fatigue and health is an excuse for failing those around her. By playing the sick role, she leaves her family without moral guidance and causes great strain for their futures. Reading Lady Bertram from the lens of fatigue might cause some discomfort. Is Austen saying through this character that fatigued mothers do a bad job in raising morally strong children? I don't think so. What we can learn from Lady Bertram is what not to do when we live with fatigue. Illness and the real suffering it causes is not an excuse to disengage from moral life or our community, nor is it an excuse to treat others badly. Now, I want to be nuanced about this. Of course, engaging in our communities takes energy, something that fatigued bodies often lack. Austen is trying to reframe our priorities here. She's trying to shift the reader away from isolating ourselves to protect our health, maybe, or for ulterior motives, and towards spending time in relationships. The reason Lady Bertram's isolation is problematic is because she does it to herself. Her community and family have the means to accommodate her and make her participation in social life relatively easy. She chooses to disengage. And if our illness means that we lose access to participating in community despite our best effort, that failure to love our neighbor, that's on our community, that's not us. But that's not what Lady Bertram is doing. To learn what kind of approach we should take in Virtue and Health, we need to look to the novel's heroine, the physically weak but morally strong Fanny Price. Fanny Price is able to resist exclusion created by the trope of the invalid through her contemplative reflection on suffering. Unlike her antagonists, Fanny does not shy away from the opportunity to reflect on the suffering and pain she has experienced. Reflection leads her, and no other character in this novel, towards constancy. Constancy for Austen is the ability to know oneself as a beloved and particular creature of God. It's about knowing your own strengths and weaknesses and knowing you have limitations. Mansfield Park paints a bleak picture for the life of 10-year-old Fanny, and the illustration I have on screen from the novel is a 10-year-old Fanny next to her aunt, Lady Bertram with the pug, and the domineering Sir Thomas standing over her. She is too easily shipped off by her mother to her wealthy aunt and uncle at Mansfield Park, where she finds little love and much suffering. Fanny's poor health and feeble nature follow her throughout the novel. She's physically unable to participate in the social life of the gentry countryside. However, Fanny's poor health illuminates the poor actions of her acquaintances, and leads to her own moral strength and courage. Her ability to reflect gives her the ability to develop the virtue of constancy. While life is difficult at Mansfield Park, difficulty only increases upon the arrival of siblings Mary and Henry Crawford. The Crawfords become the Bertrams' preferred acquaintances. Edmund, Fanny's love interest, is smitten with Mary. Henry Crawford flirts endlessly with the sisters Maria and Julia. Maria, by the way, is engaged to someone else. Drama. Fanny's character is formed by her response to the suffering caused by her adoptive family and their acquaintances. And to be clear, it's not simply that Fanny suffers that makes her virtuous. No, her virtue comes from her response to the suffering she experiences at the hands of her family and those with power. So let's return to this infamous rose-cutting incident. While trying to recover on the sofa, Edmund comes to Fanny's rescue and rebukes his mother for requiring Fanny to complete senseless tasks. He cares for Fanny, gives her a glass of medicinal wine, and rebukes himself for allowing Fanny to be treated so. And after because he's so focused on Mary Crawford, he's like losing his mind. After retreating to her attic bedroom, Fanny recognizes the care her cousin has given her, a rare moment at her life at Mansfield. This is a quote from the text. Fanny went to bed with her heart as full as on the first evening of her arrival at the park. The state of her spirits had probably had its share in her indisposition, for she had been feeling neglected and been struggling against discontent and envy for some days past. As she leaned on the sofa, to which she had retreated that she might not be seen, the pain of her mind had been much beyond that of her head, and the sudden change in which Edmund's kindness had then occasioned made her hardly know how to support herself. In this passage, we can see that Fanny acknowledges that her head aches. But the pain that stays with her, the more important pain in her mind, is that which is caused by the relationships of her adoptive family. And while the neglect of her relatives has some sway over her pain and fatigue, what she really identifies about herself in this moment is that she felt overwhelmed with Edmund's kindness. While she still feels pain of her headache, she's reminded of the moment of kindness that followed, rather than a miserable day. Fanny is not left in complete despair, but has a glimmer of hope amid her physical pain and suffering caused by the ill treatment of others. The neglect and abuse from Fanny's adoptive family would make life as an invalid tempting. If Fanny were to take on this role of an invalid, she would become exactly what her aunts think of her: morally inferior, rationally incapable, physically weak. She would no longer have to fight against the image of her family that they have constructed of her. Indeed, Fanny's life might just be easier if she accepts the abusive ways of her family. However, Fanny resists this role. Rather than succumb to the abuse of her relatives, she grows in strength and courage by reflecting on the pain she experiences. Developing self-knowledge or constancy, as Austen would have called it, it's an interior journey, but it is not individualistic. Constancy depends on relationships in community and with the land. It cannot be done without interacting with and acknowledging the needs of others. Through Fanny Price, Austen sets out a path towards virtue for weak and frail bodies, which depends on the ability to engage in introspection, which for Austen was intimately tied to prayer and one's duty to love one's neighbor. Reflection is crucial to developing a right and balanced understanding of the self and relationships, what the self truly wants, and how that fits in with relationships. Through reflection, we can avoid, or work towards avoid, becoming either too self-centered or too others-focused and self-deprecating. By engaging with her physical and emotional suffering, Fanny established the habits of reflection which lead her towards balance and well-being that is moral, physical, and emotional. Through contrasting the weak and reflective Fanny with the robust and self-absorbed Mary Crawford, Austen shows us that virtue is not a direct result of one's health. Developing virtue does not depend on having good health or robust physical ability. It's about how we respond to our health, good or bad, that will lead us to virtue. Thus, unlike the Georgian idea of illness that she inherited, Austen's novels inform us that disability does not automatically mean immorality, but good health also does not automatically mean virtue. Austen also anticipates the infantilizing turn to come, which dominates Victorian concepts of illness and disability. For Austen, any body can demonstrate virtuous character as well as immoral character. And for Mary Crawford, as she will reveal, good health does not equate to good character. And perhaps the most threatening antagonist to Fanny's future happiness is Mary Crawford. She's charming, she's lively, engaging, and clearly Fanny's opposite in health. Mary and Edmund connect after her arrival, and the two frequently seek opportunities to flirt with one another, much to Fanny's disappointment. While Mary might be capable and energetic, she takes her health for granted, and she cannot see the needs of others, or that she, as someone with good health, has any obligation to accommodate her desires for the needs of others. In an effort to get closer to Mary, Edmund offers her a chance to ride Fanny's horse, which is a big deal in Regency era. After a riding session that lasts far longer than originally stated and bleeds into Fanny's riding time, Mary offers an insincere apology to make things right. This is what she says. "My dear Miss Price," said Mary Crawford as soon as she was at all within hearing, "I am come to make my own apologies for keeping you waiting, but I have nothing to say for myself. I knew I was very late, and I was behaving extremely ill, and therefore, if you please, you must forgive me. Selfishness must always be forgiven, you know, because there's no hope of a cure." Right? Fanny's answer was extremely civil. This is still in the text. And Edmund added his own conviction that she could be in no hurry, "for there's more than enough time for my cousin to ride twice as far as she ever does," said he. "And you have been promoting her comfort by preventing her from setting out half an hour sooner. Clouds are now coming up, since she will not suffer from the heat, as she would have done then. I wish you may not be fatigued by so much exercise. I wish you'd saved yourself this walk home." This is Mary again. "No part of it fatigues me but getting off this horse, I assure you," she said as she sprang down with his help. "I am very strong. Nothing ever fatigues me but doing what I do not like." Yeah, I know. This passage gives striking insight into both Fanny and Mary's characters. Fanny takes a passive role in this social interaction, and her extremely civil answer is not even documented, as if Austen intended the reader to recognize that what Fanny says rarely matters to those who should be listening. While Fanny's speech might be restricted, her character is clearly visible through nonverbal actions, as well as later in the novel, those moments where Austen privileges us to Fanny's inner thoughts. Mary does most of the speaking in this passage and reveals her true character. First, we learn that Mary is selfish and inauthentic, caring more about her appearances than genuine relationships or authentic apologies. Second, Mary directly asserts her good health and activity. Mary's energetic personality propels her towards self-absorption while releasing her from depending on the care or help of others. Finally, Mary again reveals a flaw in her character when she acknowledges that she only experiences fatigue when she must do things she dislikes. Mary exemplifies the popular young Regency woman who has embraced the benefits of individualism and only acts to benefit her own interest. And at first glance, the capable, healthy, and amiable character, Mary seems more apt to be the heroine of a novel. She is a Lizzie Bennet, right? But when these traits are put up against Fanny's passive, gentle, and feeble nature, Mary becomes the clear adversary. Mary is everything Fanny is not. She has excellent health, she has an outgoing personality, she immediately gains the romantic interest of Edmund, and these are only traits that the inhabitants of Mansfield Park notice about her, but Fanny witnesses her true character. She witnesses that Mary is selfish, which is more than harmless self-interest, and is actually a general disdain for the well-being of others. Through the creation of a charming and healthy antagonist, Austen establishes that good health does not automatically create good character. Neither does poor health automatically signify an evil or bad nature. Good character must be developed regardless of the status of one's health. Let's explore the last example from the text. When the party arrives at the to visit the estate of Mariah's wealthy fiancé, Mr. Rushworth, the party splits into radically inappropriate groups to explore the grounds. Mariah is escorted by her fiancé and the flirtatious Henry Crawford. Fanny accompanies the infatuated Edmund and Mary, which is a real bummer for Fanny, and Julia, the youngest sister, is left with their aunt, Mrs. Norris. When Edmund, Mary, and Fanny reach a ditch, Fanny must rest after an exhausting long walk. And however, the perfectly healthy Mary Crawford cannot rest long and says, "I must move, resting fatigues me," quote from the novel. Mary cannot sit long enough to allow Fanny to recover in order to continue on as a group. Instead, she centers her own fatigue and weariness, which amounts to nothing more than boredom, while using Fanny's actual fatigue as an excuse to get some alone time, very inappropriate, with Edmund. Mary has a hard time sitting still and shows no signs of being able to enter into reflection with any kind, other than reflecting that she's bored and therefore must find a way to entertain herself. Fanny, on the other hand, experiences genuine fatigue and weariness. In these moments, she enters into reflection, and her habit of reflecting leads her to draw accurate judgments about the authentic characters of the Crawfords. She alone can recognize that their moral characters are flawed, and while they might appear proper and well-behaved, they're filled with vice. Mary is only interested in herself, and Henry is only interested in making women love him. It's only because Fanny can sit in self-reflection after difficult moments, both relationally and physically, that she can ultimately reject Henry Crawford's proposal of marriage. While his proposal will surely lead Fanny to wealth and luxury, it certainly will not lead her to happiness. Everyone at Mansfield Park believes Henry to be an advantageous match for Fanny. However, Fanny witnesses Henry's true womanizing character and identifies she could never be happily married to such a man. If she has any hope of happiness on earth, she has to be loyal to her love for her cousin Edmund. Up until Fanny's outright rejection of Crawford's first proposal, he has many, she has never said no to her adoptive family, which has caused her quite significant suffering. To be sure, she does come close at times, and her internal dilemmas cue the reader into the long and challenging journey towards constancy. Her ability to say no for the first time is significant and exhibits that she is finding that balance between her orientation towards caring for others in a self-deprecating way, and then towards her own knowledge of herself and what she needs for happiness. Fanny works towards finding balance in her physical and moral life. She does not seek to avoid pain and suffering. She does not try to become someone other than the shy and reflective person she's always been. She does not even avoid exercise or walking, even sometimes at the irrational distances requested by her aunts. Unlike Lady Bertram, she engages in community and surrounds herself and reflects upon those experiences. Through her constancy, Fanny is able to advocate for what she needs to make herself happy, while not solely pursuing her own happiness at the expense of others. So in conclusion, Fanny demonstrates to us that we can be good people without having good health. Being a good person is about being in and working towards and maintaining right relationships with others. Engaging in neighbor love for the fatigued body, this means avoiding traps like obsessing over our health or using our illness as an excuse to isolate ourselves or manipulate others. Focusing on cures to the point of obsession can take us away to what really matters, understanding ourselves and treating others well. To practice neighbor love, we should focus on finding a balance between honoring the needs and limitations of our body, like protecting our energy, and caring for others as our limitations allow. Returning to Brea's concerns and unrest, the presence of fatigue, no matter how severe, does not discount someone from being a good mother or wife. Being a good partner, parent, or friend when we have fatigue depends on how we build constancy, our own self-knowledge, so that we can enjoy our participation as we're able and avoid the traps of either becoming too self-deprecating or too health-obsessed. And for me, this journey of balance has meant that I repeatedly must surrender my tendency towards perfectionism and extremism. Pursuing a life where participating in my household community also means consistent prayerful reflection to set boundaries, work past the fear of my fatigue, honor my limitations, and trust that my community will be accommodating. Thank you very much. Is there time for questions? Yes, thumbs up. Any questions?
First of all, thank you so much. Anytime we get to play in the world of Jane Austen, it's a good way to start my morning. So deeply appreciate that. And I'm really intrigued by your presentation overall. I wonder, given the work of activists and authors like Aubrey Gordon in the fat activist space and the author of Rest is Resistance, and the way they talk about balance as a concept sort of being consumed and taken over by the wellness industry to mean largely thin, athletic, and white. Whether balance, I agree with the premise, so hear me there, but I'm curious as to whether balance as a term is ground worth competing over, because it's been largely surrendered to the wellness industry within broader popular culture. And what do we do? How do we make balance and a term with some efficacy when it's so hard for disabled or chronic conditioned people to have the ability to speak of that in a way that doesn't draw the rest of the culture back into the wellness space? Does it make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and that's such it's a great point, and I use the term balance here as a bit of an FU to that community, frankly. Excuse me for that. Because one, historically, this is the language that was used. And I am writing with this historical perspective, but also within Indian and Chinese traditional medicine, balance still plays an essential concept and role there. And to admit that we should abandon it is centering white culture, frankly. As a white woman, though, recognizing that white wellness culture is the kind of space that I can tend to get wrapped up in, I also, in this dissertation, use the word moderation. Really, I tried to bring in those terms, moderation. And Justin, your comment really does make me think, maybe I should rely more on that word, moderation, or things like equilibrium, or other words. It would be absolutely appropriate to take balance out of this. And maybe that would be something in the future I could attend to more carefully, is how the co-opting of the term balance, and how do we as people with chronic fatigue deal with that? Oh, thanks, Justin.
That might be a tangent. Feel free to the question, but in the collusion, you said anybody can build virtue, and I would be interested in how you, in your theological framework, but I know that wasn't part of your presentation, because I come from a tradition, the Quakers, who feel that God is the light of Christ is written everyone. So but I know that not everyone is scribed to that belief. But um, but so for me, it is just because we are created, there is inherent value within our body. So um, so yes, we can build virtue, but as we are created, there is already goodness.
Yeah.
So maybe the virtue is tapping into that goodness, but I think that how do we not get into that good body,
Yep.
bad body if we don't have, if we aren't building virtue? Can you go
Yes.
into that?
That's actually such a great comment. Thank you so much, Greg, for that, because by this comment, I'm responding specifically to what Austen was trying to do. And the world that she was in had this Aristotelian view that bad physical bodies, like, equated to badness or goodness, that the way you looked equated to the kind of morality you had and the way your body acted. So by Fanny being weak, frail, and delicate, a reader at that time would say, oh, she's not going to be a good person. That equation was already being made in Jane Austen's time. So what Jane Austen is doing is she's trying to disassociate exactly what you and I would say is the more authentic kind of Christian approach, that virtue does not depend on the ability or the appearance of the body. But isn't it so wild that we still have that connection today, like how we are still elevating like athletes as like the moral center of our culture, right? Or beautiful people like models get a platform. Why are we associating these people with virtue? And Austen at her time was saying that's bullshit. We need to stop doing that. And so I think it's still incredibly relevant for us today. We still absolutely need to distance this connotation and build into what Austen was saying. This is the more biblical or gospel understanding of virtue. It's about building character no matter what the body looks like. Thank you so much for that comment, Greg.
We have a question coming from online. So this question's from David online. He says, thank you for your presentation. It is such an important topic for our community. I appreciate your connection between cure and loving the neighbor. As someone with low physical stamina and limited spoons and physical capabilities, this experience has intentionally helped me love people intentionally, particularly in one-on-one relationships. These relationships can be holy and beautiful. Have you experienced this situation in your own life, or do you see an example of this in Austen's novels?
That's fantastic. What a great comment. And I would really relate to that comment that as I was perhaps an excessively able-bodied person before I became fatigued, and the experience of becoming a fatigued body, much like Fanny, helped me witness morality in a different way, in a way that I think is actually more in line with the Christian tradition and the Gospels. And it has required me to become more reflective in a way that has helped me engage in relationships with less self-obsession, frankly. And I think that that is what fatigue can offer us, and why each one of us needs to integrate the reality of fatigue into our worlds and our lives. I think in Austen texts, in Emma actually, I think is a really good example of how engaging in really intimate and quiet moments with people who have different physical abilities is a beautiful way of showing how relationship is important. And this happens in Emma between Emma and her father, Mr. Woodhouse, who is kind of noted and very obviously as a hypochondriac character. He's like terribly obsessed with health. He's like terrified at anyone who's drinking wine instead of water or not eating gruel. He's like, and he reminds me a lot of my father when he first got dementia. He would just obsess over these things about health, and there's a lot of interpretations of Mr. Woodhouse as a man who has dementia. And Emma spends time engaging with her father's needs in a really beautiful way that allows him to still have his needs. She doesn't ever, he's a very well-standing member of society. He's the richest man in the county, right? She still honors his role, but she also honors all the needs of the people around her to, like, say, eat custard rather than gruel at dinner. And so I think these novels actually present really wonderful ways of thinking critically about the role of illness. Illness isn't just this thing that we should just like let people do whatever they want because they're sick and suffering. We actually have to think critically about how to be a good person or a bad person when you're sick. And when illness is part of everyday life, as it was in Austen's time, there wasn't this like, oh, ill people are like, it wasn't so distant from everyday life, right? It was integrated into like the aspects that people think through and wrestle through every day. So that example from Emma is perhaps my favorite.
Thank you so much. This is amazing talk. I am about to show how little I know about Jane Austen here, so bear with me. And this question might be a little sideways from your work, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on examining Jane Austen on the topic of mental health. And I'm thinking particularly about the character of Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. I listened to a podcast called Hot and Bothered, which analyzes romance novels as sacred texts. And they are currently finishing a season on Pride and Prejudice. Yes. And one of the things that they pointed out was, Mrs. Bennet is portrayed as this very anxious character and, constantly worrying about things. And the text, a lot of the other characters make fun of her for this, and the text in some ways makes fun of her for this. But the hosts pointed out she's actually right to worry about a lot of the things that she worries about. She's worried about getting her daughters married off because their financial and life stability in that time and place depends on them getting married off. And so I thought that was just an interesting example of how, again, I would assume some of the stereotypes of the time are kind of contradicted by the narrative itself.
Oh, absolutely. And the Regency era is one filled with contradictions about illness in general. It's just wrapped with contradictions. But I think with Mrs. Bennet, and maybe many of us are familiar, she has these palpitations. She's like, oh, my nerves, my nerves. One, nervous disorders was a fashionable illness at that time. Frankly, people wanted it because it connected them to the upper classes. So like whenever we have an experience of nerves in that time, we always have to view it suspiciously because it was connected to fashionable illness, much like some illnesses on TikTok are today, frankly. And second, Mrs. Bennet is worrying constantly, but her own actions actively like undermine her worries. She is always terrified about getting her daughters married, but then she'll go out and behave ridiculously in public, making her daughters less marriageably eligible because she's getting drunk at like 8 p.m. at a social ball. So like she's worrying, but so Austen points out the ridiculousness of this kind of phenomenon that like, frankly, many of us have probably witnessed, in life, right? So she's trying to call attention to these realities and then questioning, like, when you're stuck in that reality as a Lizzie Bennet, what do you do? Like, when this is your reality, how do you be a good person when your mom's kind of nuts? Like, she drives you crazy, like, what should your relationship with her be like? And what should your relationship with your ultimate goal be like? It's an interesting question. It's such a great question. Thank you, Becca. I don't think I answered it, but
That's okay. Thank you.
We had one here, and then Tom.
Okay. Loved your talk. Oh my word! I think so many people here resonate with the drive of capitalism and consumer culture and having to deal with our bodies. My question's a little bit simpler. I imagine you and some of us have gotten some of the pushback that we see in some of the story and in some of the parts of your presentation from people who do actually say, well, no, you are just lazy or you are just faking. With your high-level desire to maintain good relationship, how do you respond to that in a neighbor-loving way? Wow. Teach us a little bit.
That's a fantastic question, and I think like if I were to imagine this in a Jane Austen novel, what I think our Saint Jane Austen would tell us is like there's no need to take that person as like an important part of your life. If someone's going to be rude to you, there's no need to like honor them as a person. Like for Austen's social standing, like give them the deference that they're due, but they do not owe anything other than the deference that they're due. And ridiculous people, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh from Pride and Prejudice is a great example of this. She is incredibly offensive. She tells Lizzie Bennet that based off of her social status and the events in her family that she is like garbage to her. And there's no way she could marry. She prohibits her from marrying Mr. Darcy, which she has no influence in who Mr. Darcy marries, by the way. And Lizzie Bennet goes, no, thank you. That is not who I am. I will not let you dictate like who I marry, if I will or will not marry that person. Like, kindly leave my house, to a duchess, right? She says, kindly leave my house. I think of Lizzie Bennet's response to Lady Catherine de Bourgh as many of us can imagine responding to physicians and doctors, or, mental health professionals who might have a lot of power in our spaces and have a lot of power to grant us institutional access to disability resources, who refuse to give it for basis of either, things that have said to me like fibromyalgia patients are crazy, or I don't do disability, you need to go to social services. So in that sense, we say, thank you, but I am no longer going to be, I do not care. Goodbye. I think that's how Jane Austen would inform us to respond. Thank you so much for that question, Cameron.
Oh, thank you, Jamie, for all of your insights. That's really refreshing. You kind of talk about the outward expression of one's character there. I wondered if you might comment on how chronic fatigue syndrome or disability affects your understanding of yourself or inner spirituality.
I think, so the way I'll answer this question, I don't know if this is what you're asking, maybe we can connect later, but I want to be careful with this, and I think I mentioned this earlier, like the presence of fatigue, I believe, has helped me understand morality and spirituality more than when I did not have fatigue. And that is because the presence of not getting to do what I wanted and not getting to have what I wanted and wrestling with loss that it created. And it was, I want to be careful about saying this because I did experience suffering and I did experience sadness and pain, but I also experienced through reading novels like Jane Austen a hope that I could have a different kind of life and a idea that I could accommodate my desires and my desires could change and transform. And that transformation, I believe, and perhaps this is revealing too much, but simply the fact that I picked up Mansfield Park during my 4-month bedbound illness is a note of how God will provide in moments of terror and fear and identity loss, right? I could have picked up any number of books. Any number of books have excessively able-bodied characters as heroes, right? And how is it that I picked up this book at this time and was entered into this literary world which helped me imagine a different possibility? And so when I read and when I engage in gospel texts, which for me are very important, I am now able to see the presence of fatigue and rest in a different way, right? When Jesus rests in the garden and gets angry at his disciples for constantly waking him up, I can resonate with that in a different way as someone who has terrible sleep and depends on, things like that. And so it has radically transformed how I engage in spirituality and engage in religious reflection.
All right, we have a question from online. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. This has been very good. I have not read Jane Austen, so I think you're gonna take me off to read Jane Austen now, and that will be a good thing. I'd like to go a slightly different direction, if I may. But I think it's connected to what you have been talking about in terms of fatigue and the concept that some people think if you're not always busy, that you are lazy. I'm older. I'll be 77 in November. I live in a retirement center, and I am surrounded by people who have been active all of their lives. And I think many of them feel like they need to be pushing and pushing and pushing even yet. Now, some are still able to do that, but some are not. And so I guess I would like some of, if you've thought about it, how would this all apply to older people who can no longer do what they used to do, or can no longer do it for as long as they used to do it, because it just plain simply aging and not having the stamina that they once did. And I don't know that there's any chronic fatigue there, although it may result in it in some realities, especially in a nursing situation where there's a lot they can't do. I'm afraid the question is a little convoluted, but I hope you can grapple with what I'm trying to get at here.
Thank you so much for that comment, Ben, because I think that's exactly why attending to fatigue is so important, because we will all be fatigued. Like it will happen in a world defined by capitalism, and in a world where we most likely will all age, we will all experience fatigue. And it's why centering fatigue and encompassing it into our daily expectations of reality is so essential. And so I think, frankly, the same way that Fanny engages, like people have, I mean, maybe not marriage is on the mind of the community that you're in, but having good friendships is still essential. And so engaging in those questions of good character based off of the body is still a really critical part of thinking through how to build relationships when fatigue is present. So when you're making friendships and people say, no, sorry, I can't engage with that, or I can't come over, like, I can't engage with you, how are you either accommodating their need to rest or not making judgments about yourself, or making about yourself that they don't want to hang out with me because they're not spending time with me, right? So these questions about building relationships, I think, are the same for those who are aging and those who have chronic fatigue. And it's about centering, what does it mean to be in right relationship with the person before me? And that question of right relationship is defined by a lot of things. It's defined by power structures. It's defined by social status. It's defined by gender, age, race. But it's also defined by personality, right? Is this person soft and gentle, and am I a crass kind of nature? And so how do I enter into relationship with them so that we can both have space for ourselves?
Okay, if I don't see any other questions, then perhaps we should collectively thank Dr. Jaime here for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all.